Good afternoon from Manila. But also we'd like to start this webinar. This is second in a series of webinar by the University of the Philippines, CFAL Philippines. And this time, we all welcome you. We welcome everyone all over the world. We welcome 147 registered participants to this webinar. And we have people tuning in from practically all over, from Armenia, Austria, Australia, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, United States of America, Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, Libya, Madagascar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, India, and Singapore. And we have as well our local organizations. There are various participants coming from the Department of Affairs, the Filipinos Overseas, Commission on Human Rights, and other Philippine government agencies. We have as well among our registered civil society organizations, recruitment agencies, research, university think tanks, including the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. And of course, we have with us people from international and national academic institutions, the International Organization for Migration, and other United Nations agencies. Thank you very much for signing up, for joining us in this afternoon's webinar. We appreciate very much your participation and your cooperation. We also have people, prominent individuals who are joining us, Board of Regents of the University of the Philippines, Commissioner on Human Rights. We have Escalibrini Migration Center, the UMWA under the DFA. We have also Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, labor attaché. We have members of leaders and board members of civil society organizations. We have from the Academe, the Miriam College, and the Women and Gender Institute. And we have ICMPD, Attorney Golda Roma, tuning in and joining us in this particular conversation. Once more, we are proud to co-sponsor along with the Rights Corridor and also together with the International Organization for Migration, this particular webinar, which is entitled COVID-19 as Mobility Crisis, Repatriation of Migrants from the Gulf States. As we very know, this topic is quite relevant and timely at this point over the world, not just relevant to the Philippines. As it is, migration and mobility is a global issue. And at the moment, it is doubly important and crucial because migration is impacted by COVID-19, the pandemic, and likewise, the pandemic impacts on mobility and migrants. And at this particular time, we will look at two sides, two angles: migration, mobility, and the movement of people from the Gulf states, particularly to the Philippines, back to the Philippines. But we have to also look at the trigger of this huge, enormous mobility crisis, which is the COVID-19. On both ends of the world, whether it is coming from the Gulf state or considering to the Philippines, mobility to the Philippines, there are challenges and issues that both sides face in the context of coming home to the Philippines, but also moving from the workplace. So in this particular webinar, I'd like to first say to our audience, to the participants, that the webinar is fully recorded and that the presentations of our experts and resource persons will be shared through the email addresses of our participants after this webinar. We will have a generous time for question and answer from the audience, and for purpose of viewing by the panelists, they may look at the Q&A portion at the bottom of their computers. And hopefully we have a reserved time for the Q&A. I please request that everyone speaks in English because our participants come from all over the world. Now, as a way of introducing this topic, we see on the map here the spread of COVID, the distribution of COVID all over the continents in different countries and globally. As of last night, we have a total count of 5,691,790 cases of COVID. And obviously, we have a large number of cases in the North America, but also, as you can see here on the screen, the Gulf registered the 96,794 cases as of yesterday. And the map speaks for itself. The biggest, as you can see, comes from Riyadh. And you also have Qatar, and so with the others that you see on the map. So the Gulf states are actually very much affected by the pandemic. Next, please. Because of this, we also have to look at we have to look also that in the case of the Philippines, we have various players in terms of migration. The employment characteristics is actually the employment is characterized by different government, by the private recruitment agency, hiring by employer, and there is a very little figure there, which is recruitment by other sectors. So as you can see, we have the recruitment and the social protection being taken care of also by these different sectors. In the case of the Philippines, the private recruitment agency plays a large role, a big role in the recruitment itself, as well as ensuring social protection. Next, please. And as we go on with the presentation, as we can see, we will be looking at repatriation as a big issue at this point in time. Repatriation of migrants is itself ordinary times an issue which is by the Philippines in terms of absorbing and keeping our professionals and our migrant workers. But extraordinarily during COVID times, there is a huge number of those who are being repatriated. And particularly this afternoon, I would like to give way to our special speaker coming from, and who is an expert on the Gulf states. Therefore, we have with us, may I welcome our panelists. First of all, we have in our battery of expert panel and panelists, we have our key speaker coming from, who is himself the managing director of the Rights Corridor, Froilan Jr. I'll introduce him in a little while, more lengthily. Have our friend from the Office of the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs under the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Undersecretary Sarah Lou Areola. Thank you very much for joining us, Ma'am Yusek. We also have with us a very experienced person from the LBS Recruitment Solutions and the CEO himself of a recruitment agency, Mr. Lito Soriano. These are the two reactors to our key speaker. But in the end, we have our partner in crime, so to speak, on the issue of migration, always there to support us, Christine Dedi from the International Organization for Migration in the Philippines. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for sharing with us the panel today on web. Now, without much ado, I give the floor now to Mr. Froilan Malit. Froilan is actually, as I mentioned, the founding managing director of the Rights Corridor, an advisory committee member of the ILO Regional Office for the Arab States, an associate at the Gulf Labor Markets and Migration, a research fellow of the UPC-FAL Philippines. He worked at the Abu Dhabi Dialogue's Permanent Office and at the Office of the Philippine Ambassador at the UAE. He's currently doing his graduate studies on international relations and politics at the University of Cambridge, and he graduated from the Cornell University and the University of Oxford. So may I welcome, let us all please welcome and listen to Froilan Malit Jr. You have the floor, Froilan.
Thank you, Dr. Ednaco, for this exceptional opportunity and collaboration. And thank you to our CFO staff, Catherine Lau, Luke, and Rights Corridor staff members as well, Henry and Angelo, and our distinguished guests and panel members. I want to thank our Labor Attaché, Felicitas Pai, our Consul General, Paul Raymond Cortez, our Philippine-based partner, Carmelita Nuki, and my colleague, Gerasimos Serafas from Birmingham University, for collectively offering legal, political, and rights perspectives, in the context of Philippine Gulf Migration Corridor. Now, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's an exceptional crisis, placed in an exceptional moment in contemporary times. And in recent months, COVID-19 has tested governments, domestic and foreign policy institutions, the healthcare system, and even their patients. And if you look at, this kind of crisis, in the past, the Philippines has dealt with a lot of crises. In Libya in 2014, in Kuwait in 1990s, in Iraq 2003, and in the UAE as well, the financial crisis in 2008. But the difference between this crisis and those prior crises was that the COVID-19, it's a global one, and the prior ones actually were occurred both at a national or regional context. Now, as COVID-19 intensifies in the Gulf region, a lot of Gulf countries, have started to using more restrictive policies to protect, their economies. And as a result, we see this massive floating unemployed population. And these populations have to deal with a lot of the no work, no pay culture. And COVID-19 has then moved from a public health risk to more economic, security, and foreign policy risk. And one element that we'll talk about today is this issue of migrant repatriation. Now, I've divided this presentation into three specific areas. First, we'll look at the context and data. We'll specifically look at how high share of migrant population and migrant sectoral distribution dually offers opportunities and risks for Gulf states and sending countries. And as cases go up, we will look at Gulf states' political and policy responses, in the context of migrant repatriation, and how they support and undermine sending countries' foreign policy protection measures in the Gulf countries. And lastly, as Gulf countries move, towards economic recession and eventually follow a more harder repatriation approach, meaning mass repatriation, deportation, more fines, localization policies, and migrant expulsions in certain cases. The question is, are sending countries' policies like the Philippines realistic and sustainable in governing migrant repatriation? So I specifically looked at three questions here. Next slide, please. Right, so three questions that we'll look at. First is, how did COVID-19 impact Gulf countries' domestic and foreign policies related to labor migration? And the second part is, how did these policies differentially impact different categories of sending states, those strong states versus those weak states. And what do these political, dynamics mean for a country like the Philippines in a more post-COVID-19 migration context? So let's look at these different questions. So if you look at the data, right, pre-COVID non-migration context, in the Gulf, you have about 53 million population. It's the third largest migrant destination globally. So you have about 29 million migrant workers. 70% of migrant workers are either in UAE or in Saudi. And Saudi is the most populous one, roughly 12 million. Now, a lot of foreign migrant workers outnumber locals in the private sector, although there's a huge proportion as well of migrant workers in the public sector as well. Now, during the pre-COVID crisis context, high share of migrants, often would constitute high benefits. So for a lot of Gulf countries, this could mean more income. The fees that are being extracted from processing all these migrant workers' documents, right? And it also helps them close labor market shortages that they needed across sectors, be it domestic, hospitality, nursing, etc. Now, for sending countries, it's actually great during the pre-COVID because you have high levels of remittances, access to employment. And remember, the interstate relationship between, sending countries like the Philippines and the Gulf, it goes beyond labor. It also, is linked to trade, agriculture, investments, and a lot of interstate economic, arrangements between countries. Now, who actually dominates, the Gulf sector? So next slide, please. So some states actually dominate certain sectors than others. Now, if you look at the current data, 90% of migrant workers actually come from South Asia, and India constitutes roughly 7.3 million. Now, over the past decades, different sending states have actually, carved a niche for themselves. So for example, India has been able to dominate, the construction, hospitality, the nursing sector, and a lot of the engineering too. Now, Philippines, for example, has also dominated specifically the nursing, domestic work, construction in certain cases, in certain fields, and the hospitality sectors. Now, what you're seeing here is that sending states have used different methods to actually secure their competitiveness. And it also reflects how aggressive they were even in the past, right? To protect and actually secure a higher share, because higher share could, give you more higher employment and higher levels of remittances. So to an extent, they reciprocally exploit their national resources, in this case, labor. And this also shows you that it's a complex sort of, calculus, both in terms of domestic and their foreign policies. Now, next slide, please. Now, with the current context, it's flipped, So high migrant share would now constitute, more high risks in high certain migrant, sectoral distribution, like domestic work construction, especially those who live in high-risk industrial camps, constitutes, high, risk for a lot of Gulf countries and sending countries. So for the Gulf countries, high propensity of migrants, in this case, UAE and Qatar, for example, 90% of their migrants are actually, they're migrant workers. So they outnumber local population. So that basically could translate into high propensity to spread the virus, right? Specifically linked to those undocumented migrants as well. Now, for sending countries, that could mean low remittance. That could mean resource constraints in terms of their budgets, in terms of the capacity of their frontline diplomatic missions to extend protection. Now, as cases go up, right, Gulf countries, have struggled to actually, manage this particular COVID-19 effect on their local economy. They've done a lot of mass testing, yet they had to face a lot of these, economic tensions in terms of imposing, tougher lockdowns to control the spread of COVID-19. They injected 180 billion in total to help, the private sector to rejuvenate sort of the local economy. And right now, the cases are going up, yet they're still, partially opening the market because they have to survive, right? So what you're seeing here is that with all these lockdowns, there are different proportions of migrants who are facing, unemployment, no work, no pay. And Gulf countries have also revised their labor laws in order to protect, private employers as opposed to migrant workers. So as a result, you have this economic shock. Gulf countries have to create different, methods to reduce, this high migrant population share, and at the same time limit the risks, right? Specifically in the context of undocumented migrant workers. So if you look at their repatriation policies, next slide, please, you can clearly see that different countries like Bahrain and Kuwait use amnesty measures. So they actually, all of them want to reduce the share of migrant workers. Bahrain and Kuwait are slightly smaller, so they use amnesty policies to reduce public health risk specifically related to irregular migrant workers. UAE and KSA actually focus on those either stranded or migrants who've just completed their contracts because they wanted to make sure that they would directly target these and reduce, high migrant population share. Now, if you compare and contrast these, particular approaches, what you could see here is that Gulf countries with high migrant share, like Saudi and UAE, in terms of absolute numbers, so we're looking at 22 million here, the 70% of migrant population share in the Gulf countries, they're very cautious, and instead they use incentive-based repatriation model to slowly, right, phase out workers. Now, there's a lot of criticisms, from the international organizations that you can't really repatriate without addressing these social protection issues, just making sure that a lot of these workers would get the appropriate rights that they have, unpaid wages, et cetera, et cetera. So big, Gulf states, Saudi, UAE, they're cautious, incentive-based, wanted to reduce population measure, and they cannot impose an amnesty because these countries are huge and it requires bureaucratic, institutions, resources, and it also violates their social distancing measures. So they're very, very cautious. If you open the market, that 22 million, that's going to create a drastic effect on their economies. Now, smaller countries like Kuwait and Bahrain, they actually took a more rigorous, and aggressive approach, within the context of humanitarian policies that they have. So they pass these amnesty, and specifically to deal with like public health risks, right? And incentivize undocumented workers to come out because it's very difficult if you're undocumented and you get COVID. A lot of Gulf countries view those as risky because if you're undocumented and you fear being deported, you're more likely not going to report and you're more likely to spread this virus. So that's exactly what they did. So they're not homogeneous, there are differences, different nuances that they've taken in order to protect this. Now, with these political tensions, Gulf countries actually struggle, to handle this because they're running out of money, right? Sovereign wealth funds are also being under pressure, no tax collections. They're involved in, different, interstate wars. And Gulf countries have to find ways to actually shift this pressure because, migration governance, it's a shared responsibility between Gulf and sending countries. So what a lot of Gulf countries have been seeing is sort of the different degrees of cooperation. So when I say cooperation, I'm referring to sending countries travel restriction policies, repatriation timing and response, and the type of diplomatic approaches that they've undertaken in order to address the repatriation process of their migrants. So next slide, please. And then the other one. Next slide, yes. So Gulf countries view, the sending countries as high, medium, low sort of degrees of cooperation. Now, Pakistan actually has been the most proactive here, partly because of their regional security agreements, And when I say proactive, I'm referring to the repatriation timing and quarantine approaches and, the travel sort of openings that they've done in order to quickly repatriate these nationals. They have high share here. That's why they were able to act more swiftly in order to repatriate their nationals. And, there are also pressures from Gulf governments to do that. Now, India, it has moved from medium to high. India has even sent a lot of ships and chartered planes, to negotiate the repatriation of their nationals. Philippines is actually a bit quite interesting because there's this interagency tension, even within Senate, restricting sort of the proportion to 400. And then you have these diplomatic missions, in the UAE, in the Gulf, struggling to repatriate all these nationals. So you have sort of this interstate tension, right? This coordination issue that's actually undermining the capacity of our diplomatic missions to deliver their work. And then you have smaller countries like Nepal with very small fiscal budget, right? Struggling to actually repatriate these nationals. So you're seeing sort of different types of sending countries reacting differently in order to repatriate these their nationals. And Gulf countries are either rewarding or punishing these. So rewarding in terms of giving them preferential trade agreements in relationships, and certain diplomatic favors, and then punishment in terms of restricting potential quotas and blocking sectoral work permits. I think Ms. Tetis Mangahat mentioned this. And what you're seeing here is that the way you deal with them, the way you engage with them, would eventually lead to these rewards and punishments. And UAE basically sent a very clear message to a lot of sending countries, a few months back, that if you don't repatriate, you will face these consequences. And I think that's what triggered a lot of sending countries like India and Pakistan to act swiftly. Yet they are constrained because they have also domestic populations of billions or even millions that they have to deal with, plus their foreign migrant population, outside. Now, next slide, please. So as Gulf states, use this different sort of mechanisms, right, to repatriate these nationalities, different migrant nationalities, different states would then lead to different precariousness, right? So there are, and these precariousness are often linked to the type of fiscal policy in terms of budget, interagency coordination, their institutional maturity in terms of migration governance, Philippines actually being a leader, and a lot of sending countries are, basically following the Philippine model, the political leadership, and the role and influence of diplomatic missions. Now, Philippines has been sort of the most proactive one because it has been able to extend optional repatriation, which is complementary to the Gulf policies, and social amelioration, assistance, the $200 plus the free food that are being given, across the Gulf countries. I've seen it in the case of, in Dubai, with labor attaché policies of Dubai, extending all these support, and then you see less proactive states, with low proactive, like for example, in Nepal. In fact, Nepal is still developing its contingency plan at the moment, right, to repatriate these nationals. And you can clearly see here that, given sort of the different types of fiscal budget that they have, institutional maturity, and sort of political will, it affects the degrees of proactiveness and cooperation. And that in turn, produces diplomatic tensions with Gulf countries because they are constrained domestically. And I think that's an interesting question that I'm pretty sure our undersecretary would further unpack in the case of the Philippines. Now, the third part of the talk would look at what happens if Gulf countries, if cases go up and they actually start using more harder repatriation measures. So at the moment, it's optional. So at the moment, what's happening in the Gulf is that they're using both direct and more recently indirect, right, methods of repatriation. So as you can clearly see here on the next slide, please. So direct methods, they're using deportation, right? So in the case of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, what they're saying now is that if you violate curfew policies, you could be deported. But before that, they were very flexible, but now they're actually more aggressive in terms of addressing this. And actually that could really serve their interest in terms of limiting or reducing the number of migrant population. Localization policies, have also kicked in. So Kuwait has decided to phase out migrant workers in the public sector. Oman's Ministry of Finance has encouraged its private sector to eliminate, migrant workers, except those working in the cleaning industry. Kuwait also has passed and is currently discussing their cultural diversification policies, where they would impose, race-based quotas. Like for example, only 15% of Filipinos can live and work in the Gulf, right? And these policies have been in the past actually, but they were not strongly influenced because these are, private. The difference between Gulf and a lot of other East Asian countries is that Gulf countries, they follow a private sector recruitment model, but East Asian, they follow more government to government. So Gulf countries in turn are powerless in terms of determining the proportion of migrants that they have within their private sector. Indirect methods are also using, economic measures like VAT, cost of living and expenses, the fees and sanctions if you violate these policies. These are actually indirectly pushing migrants now slowly, right? Because it makes them, it makes it difficult to live in the Gulf countries with these type of restrictive, draconian economic policies. Social policy as well, when it comes to the real estate, the housing market, and the limited social welfare assistance and repatriation tickets. Only Kuwait has actually offered free tickets to these migrant workers. Now, the real estate part is very interesting because they have to make sure Gulf countries are very protective of the value of the real estate, and they're really not lowering the rent for a lot of migrant workers. And I think that creates a lot of issues in terms of, in terms of whether migrant workers will be able to survive in the long run. And then the other part actually looks at, these soft repatriation models. They do contribute significantly in terms of reducing migrant share. Now, all of these different cases, right, it really brings in, the issue of the Philippines. Next slide, please. So there's a medium cooperation, right? Because Pakistan is doing quite well than Philippines, and there's this high degree of proactiveness, right? So we want to actually repatriate, right? Yet at the same time, migrants resist. And this has been historically justified, in the case of Libya. And workers actually, they try to cope, because they don't trust, to a large extent, our government's ability to produce jobs in the Philippines. So they're willing to deal with no work, no pay, the wage cuts, bad living conditions. They're ready to fight because they know, right, that they have much better economic opportunities back home. Those are both perceptions and reality. Now, they also use illegality as coping strategy. They would say, I'd rather be illegal here and make money in the informal market than in the Philippines. And even, low quality or no access to healthcare, housing, or informal markets, they just don't care because they want to stay and fight because they believe that they have more economic prospects here back home. And what are the implications for this, for sending countries like the Philippines? Well, our foreign policy, it's a lot difficult to actually define your foreign policy when you have, your nationals resisting, right, to cooperate because of their own certain reasons, Our missions as well have also been impacted because you couldn't really deliver much, when, there's a less degree of cooperative framework between your migrants and then the government. Legitimacy as well is a big factor because it kind of challenges, whether a state like the Philippines can protect in the case of, migration crisis framework that you're seeing at the moment. Now, if you look at some of the policy questions I just want to raise to our Undersecretary. So next slide, please. So the first question is, are these policy responses that we're doing, are they sustainable and short, medium term, and long run, given the defiance of Filipino workers? They will stay for the next 6 months to 1 year, and that's a fact. So how are these going to affect our approach? The second question. And so the question is, as they move from soft to hard mandatory repatriation approaches, how is it feasible, right? Again, to challenge their choices, and I think this is something that I do hope our panelists will be able to unpack even more. And then the third question is, how do you envision, right? I think, yeah, so basically, how do you realistically manage this pandemic crisis, when you have a dwindling fiscal budget, interagency tensions, and growing domestic population's health and economic security back home in the Philippines? 100 million there, 10 million plus outside. And the last question basically is, how do you envision, the post-COVID-19 Philippine labor foreign policy towards, authoritarian states like the Gulf and the Middle East, Asia, and other destination countries? And the last point that I want to make, Dr. Edna, is that Gulf migrants, give political legitimacy to the Gulf states and sending states. In fact, Gulf-based migrants like Filipinos, they are key ingredients to the long-term economic growth and development, right, of the Gulf states and also sending states in the Philippines and other Asian countries. The key bottleneck question is, how can labor sending countries like the Philippines develop a foreign labor policy that favors rights, access, and better welfare protection, specifically in the context of health, while at the same time maintaining strong diplomatic, presence and reputation and relationships, with the Gulf countries. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The whole package of ideas, very rich ones, very comprehensive as well. I think you have touched on many dimensions of the labor migration, not only on the Philippines, but you have showed us also the context of the Gulf and how other countries who are similar to the Philippines sending labor migrants over to the Gulf states have been behaving. But I think you raise some very interesting questions which are thrown back to the Philippines and to Filipino governance and Filipino leaders themselves, which is what's going to be the outcome of the policies, whether the policies have to do with labor policies, with social policies, or even with diplomatic relations to the Gulf states by the Philippines. So trying to narrow down now, we're looking at from a very large Gulf states perspective vis-a-vis the individual countries who are sending migrants to the Gulf states. We're now focusing and streaming on the Philippine case. And for this, I think there are some aspects, some questions raised by Fräulein, which can probably be further enlightened to us by someone from the government sector, the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs. And I'm referring to our next speaker, our reactor to Fräulein Malit's input and her thoughts also on how Philippines deals with repatriation of migrants at this point in time. Our reactor, our next speaker is the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs of the Department of Foreign Affairs. She was Chief of Staff of the Majority Floor Leader in the Senate. She obtained her law degree from the Ateneo de Manila University and her LLM at the International Human Rights Law from the University of Essex. She has an award in the roster of Gawad Mabini with the rank of Dakilang Kamanog or the Grand Cross. I am now giving the floor to USEC Undersecretary of the UMWA, USEC Sara Lou Ariola, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ko. Good afternoon, fellow panelists. And I'd like to greet, of course, the Chief of Mission of IOM, Christine Daly. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Before I started my reaction, I'd just like to give a brief overview about the repatriation process in the Middle East. Next slide, please. As of today, we have repatriated already 6,457 Filipinos from the Middle East. We have 148 sea-based OFWs. They just happened to be in the port of UAE, so they were repatriated from there. And the land base is 6,309. Next slide, please. If you could see as to the numbers, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, UAE, Baghdad, and of course the biggest numbers, Jeddah and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I'd like to disagree with the main speaker as to the resistance of people who want to be repatriated. Actually, it's the other way around. We are deluged with requests for repatriation. Thousands of people want to come home, and the difficulty actually when the airports closed, that was the bigger crisis that we have to deal with. In fact, when the airports closed, people were really bombarding us in social media and in our posts because they want to come home. We're expecting another around 30,000 in the next 2 months from all over the world, and particularly in the Middle East. I won't name which countries, but most repatriation requests comes from the bigger countries that host many overseas Filipino workers. Now, it's a totally different thing. War is something that Filipinos can deal with, but definitely not COVID-19. At this point in time, when everything is uncertain, a lot of people, just because they're not earning anything anymore, they'd rather be with their families. So there is a deluge of requests for repatriation. Next slide, please. As to the COVID-19 related assistance, we have given all our post-standby funds, which is for repatriation assistance, provision of emergency supplies, medicine, food, and accommodation to overseas Filipinos affected by COVID-19. And of course, shipment of remains. Unfortunately, there are several Filipinos who died. So it's allowed as if they want the whole body or the remains to be brought home. We allow it as long as the coffin is hermetically sealed and subject to cremation within 12 hours upon arrival in the Philippines. And of course, the shipment of remains. Some Middle East countries don't cremate, so the whole body has to be shipped back to the Philippines. Okay, actually that's all my update, but I just want to talk about the GCC countries and their response to COVID-19. Not all GCC countries are created alike. For example, Kuwait and Bahrain. Kuwait had an amnesty because they wanted to repatriate undocumented irregular workers. On the contrary, Bahrain has another reason for the amnesty because they want the irregular to regularize. Yesterday, we were having a live FB live with the CEO of Labor Market Regulatory Authority, and he was saying that instead of since the borders are closed now, instead of recruiting from outside Bahrain, they are recruiting inside Bahrain, and since there's already they already lack medical practitioners like nurses. Many nurses in Bahrain who were in other professions have been recruited in the medical field. And in fact, he was even giving assurance that they do not have a separate migration policy as to migrants because they treat migrants and citizens alike as to healthcare. And one of the problems also that is seen in the Middle East, I just had a web meeting with Ambassador Alonto a while ago, an hour ago, and Consul General Jack Cortez of Dubai. We were talking about the accommodations. The problem really is the migrants are being infected because they live in cramped accommodations. And of course, now Dubai is opening up. It's going to be a problem. And I think since we have someone from the recruitment agency right now, perhaps because we're talking about a labor issue and a human rights issue also, right to health and right to work, now the sleeping quarters or the accommodations is going to be eventually be part of the contract to protect the health of our workers. Before, we don't really talk about it. Not all employers will give their workers accommodation where there are only two to a room. But some of the employers will just give them, an allowance for the accommodation. So people, to save money, will live in cramped quarters. But that's now unacceptable for during COVID. As to the responses, also before I go to the questions, we just like to say that one of the things, we have a very close relationship with a GCC country. We have international assistance and cooperation with Bahrain. In fact, they have a flexi visa program that has worked for our Filipinos because it allows Filipinos to have multiple employers. And the Philippine government initially was the one who bought the visas for Filipinos, and now the visas are being given for free except for the medical insurance and some other fees. And they are encouraging now the migrants to take that so that if they get sick, they have a health insurance. In fact, in Bahrain, we have the lowest number of requests now for repatriation. Ambassador Ver was saying there will only have 95 requests, where we have 55,000 Filipinos. So if it can be done in one GCC country, then it can be done, I think, in others. It's just that they have one of the very good practices in the Middle East, and there is no intent to deport, and they're not deporting actually, or to lessen the migrant workers there, because they have already an acceptance, or they realize that migrants are part of their lives, and Filipinos have become part of their society, and they cannot live without migrants because 55% of their societies are migrants. And the same with UAE, with Qatar and everything. There are more migrants than nationals. As to the Philippine policy responses, sustainable in the short, medium, and long run periods, actually, if you go back to the Migrant Workers Act, the fact is we do not encourage migration. It was an option before when we couldn't sustain our economy. But now the president has said that any Filipino who wants to come home should come home. That's why part of the migration process is reintegration. So we have to really work harder to be able to reintegrate our OFWs into society, and we have also to realize that it is COVID-19 is not here to stay forever, and there's still life with COVID-19. As we can see, our household service workers are not asking for repatriation because they're an integral part of the home. Our health workers are still have the best employment at the moment anywhere in the world, and in fact all the Middle East countries are asking for our health workers. We just have a labor ban at the moment for health workers, and even Europe and in the Americas. So there's going to be that sector that will continually migrate. We as economies open, there will be more opportunities. Like now, Dubai has opened, and so those people working under no work, no pay, they'll be able to go back to work. But the downside there is the risk will always be very high. As to the mandatory repatriation process, I mean, we are not asking people at the onset of this crisis. DFA was given the task to repatriate. At this onset, people did, I mean, very few requests. But come April and now May, people just want to come home simply because they're there in the Middle East without their families just because they want to earn. If they couldn't earn anymore, they'd rather be here in the Philippines. So the only difficulty, of course, is ensuring that they're not infected and bringing them back to the provinces. That's why we're hurrying to be able to accommodate the request. And if anyone who works in our embassies and posts in the Middle East, the Philippine ROFWs are very frustrated because they cannot come home. They don't want to stay if they have no source of income there. And the other question is, how can sending countries like the Philippines realistically manage its pandemic crisis following the challenges? I think one thing about the Philippines, and Filipinos are very resilient. Our labor department is doing its best to create jobs here in the Philippines, and more than that, also I think this is also the time that a lot of our OFWs are looking at the Overseas Welfare Fund, because we have 19.6 billion, which is, I think, to a certain extent, it's there to answer for the reintegration process of our Filipinos. And I think this is a trust fund, and this is the money that, and this is the kind of crisis that where it should be used. And I think I'm confident that it's enough, or more than enough, to answer to help our overseas Filipinos move forward, and also to rebuild their lives here in the Philippines. What's our foreign policy? We still don't encourage migration. I mean, but it's always an option. And if there's going to be a migration, there should be safe, orderly, and regular. The COVID-19 crisis literally stopped trafficking in persons, because there are people can just enter any territory now, and it's a blessing in disguise. And I think the COVID-19 crisis is a reset button for our migration policy, because it's like going back to zero. We can it's our time to reflect on what's happening. It's our time to reflect on what should be taken out of our policies. It's in our time also to consider how to protect our overseas Filipino workers. In the end, I think at the end of the day, and I'm saying this with confidence, the GCC countries need us as much as we need them. Migrants will always be part of their society one way or another. And of course, our migrants, especially in the service industry, and particularly for in the health industry, like the kind of service that we give is second to none. And we will always be part of that diaspora. But what's important at this point is for us to be able to move forward in ensuring that the migration will be safe, orderly, and regular should our citizens still decide to migrate. But at the same time, as part of government, it's also time for us to really do double time to provide jobs here in the Philippines, since there's really, we are expecting an exodus of our millions of migrant workers. We have more than 10 million. We have around 2.2 million in the Middle East. I don't think a million will be coming home because they're still needed there, whatever happens. But it's as I said, we're back to zero, and it's an opportunity, and we're very optimistic that things will be well, and we will be able to fix things. And if they believe in building back better, we could have a better migration policy, a better protection, safer migration, and this time, maybe this time, all forms of migration will be safe, orderly, and regular. Thank you, and good afternoon.
All right, there you go. Thank you very much for the very rich input as well. And Yusek Ariola has steered further conversation on this particular topic. I recall that as of yesterday, when I attended a meeting of local government units group, what people are trying to say is that there is one thing that the COVID-19 has brought as an opportunity for the Philippines and the Filipinos. It is for the Philippines to consider as well the call of the national government for a Balik Probinsya program that coincides with the repatriation of our overseas Filipino workers, the migrant workers. And I think this particular situation challenges us to look into what's going to be probably a long-term or probably a reintegration program that is being offered by the country for those migrants who are coming back, who wanted to come back. After all, mobility and migration should be a choice. And for as long as there are opportunities that are built around the chances for Filipinos to work back home, then we have probably a better, and we can grow the economy better. So let us look at the conversation also as something that includes another sector in our society. And in the Philippine case, the recruitment agency or the recruitment industry is a very significant player in the case of migrant workers from the Philippines. And because of this, we cannot not listen to a representative from the recruitment industry. I am now calling on our next speaker. He is he's chairman and president of the LBS Recruitment Solutions Corporation. Personally, he worked in Saudi Arabia for 5 years before running the recruitment business for over 20 years now. He is president of the Philippine Association of the Service Exporters and the Philippine Association of the Manpower Agencies accredited to Taiwan. I am referring to no other than Loreto Soriano, who will talk about the impacts of the pandemic to the OFWs and the impact to the recruitment industry, and what might be the future of the industry in the post-pandemic era. So may I call on now, Lito, you have the floor now. Are we missing Lito? All right. In the meantime, that we're waiting for Lito Soriano, could we also please try to look at, I invite the panelists to look at the Q&A. Some of the questions are already there. And I think the Q&A is growing. There are a number of questions now which many from our participants would like our panelists to answer. So if Lito is now ready.
Do you hear me now, Director Go?
Oh, yes,
Hi.
yes. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon to Director Go and Sipal. Thank you for inviting me, and also to my fellow panelists and to our panelists, to our participants. My brief reaction would be our beliefs in the recruitment sector. In the GCCs, we in the recruitment industry estimate more or less 100,000 OFWs will be clamoring for repatriation in the next 12 months, unless vigorous counseling and guidance to encourage these workers to be more discerning and consider changes in their salaries, employment benefits, and increasing cost of living in the Middle East. Also, they have to be considerate also on the effort now by different Gulf countries to hire inside, meaning they will now allow intra-company transfers of workers. Those that are being retrenched or terminated will be collected by the government and then offered to companies that may require their services. To bring home 50,000 to 100,000 OFWs in the next 12 months or more is a great challenge given the limitation of capacities as well as cost in air travel. Now, if the plane can accommodate 400 passengers, the allowed would probably only 150. Repatriation will actually start soon as lockdowns and travel bans are lifted there and here in the Philippines. Employers may not have funds to provide free air tickets to its own terminated or resigning employers when they start or wanting to go home. The Philippine government must adopt a policy of job preservation in the job sites to maintain our share, coupled with heightened diplomatic and labor issues dialogues with host governments. We must be careful on our plans or the government plans to ban deployment of nurses to GCCs while there is no hiring program for these nurses by the Department of Health. The temporary ban, we don't know how many were hired ex-OFWs or hired OFW nurses. We might be sending wrong signals. We believe also that there must be an integrated and deliberate overseas employment recovery plan for this 45-year-old sector. It must be formulated and included in the proposed 23 billion national recovery and stimulus plan of the government. May I proceed to my tip marks, a profiling of the employers. As we have been recruiting workers for over a long period of time, what happened actually is a total stoppage of work. The problem is not just health, but it ensued a financial crisis that's now about 3 months. Majority of employers are dependent in government-funded projects. So if the government, the current government will be downsizing their budgets for this new fiscal year, then it will heighten the chances of higher retrenchment or even lockdown, bankruptcies among employers. Medium and large companies, as observed in 2008, will be more vulnerable, may lay off and retrench a larger number of migrant workers, including OFWs. This problem is really ionic. You know? It's something very new, such that contingency plans are rendered obsolete by the COVID-19. And very few companies in the Middle East have their own business continuity planning. But even if you have, the economic climate is really full of uncertainties. You cannot predict what happens in the next 6 to 12 months. Now, in the Philippines, the profile of our OFWs in the Philippines, I'm looking at stranded. Who are stranded in the Philippines? there are a large number of balik manggagawa workers, or these are the workers that are on leave, or they were on vacation because they signed a new contract. And these are returning with expired re-entry visas to Saudi Arabia or to the host government. And a large number of them are stranded in the National Capital region. Another group of OFW that are stranded in the Philippines are those that were already selected by the employers and the recruitment agencies, and they have already completed all the recruitment process. They already have the overseas employment certificate, they have visa, they have tickets, but the lockdowns and the travel bans catch up. And a great number of them are also locked down here in Metro Manila. The other group of workers that are stranded are those that are already selected, but are not yet processed in the POA. Some of them may not still have visa, but they are about to complete all the necessary documentation for them to leave. Next, some of them are also stranded in NCR. In fact, our sector submitted to OWA the list of OFWs that are stranded. These are the new hire OFWs, numbering around close to 7,000, and we are clamoring for support to be for them to be transmitted back to their provinces. But the local government unit are asking for clearances, and also there's a need for them to undergo PCR testing before they are going to be allowed to arrive or get inside different barangays, municipalities, and provinces. Next slide, please. Okay, what is the profile of the recruitment agencies? Very few have contingency plans. Among us, you can count very few numbers. No one, I believe, has practiced or implemented a business continuity planning. Except for large household recruitment agency, those that are recruiting domestic workers, most of us does not have enough savings to last 6 months of operations. The agencies that has no placement fee model, meaning we spend in advance the cost of recruitment, the cost of deploying them, have millions of dollars of receivables. And these employers are telling us they are unable to pay because they are also affected by the crisis and there's no more projects. Why this happened? In the Middle East, the usual payment terms for skilled and professional deployment is between 30 to 90 days upon arrival. So meaning we can only expect payments from those services that we should receive from the employers after 30 or 60 or 90s. In fact, we have receivables that aged up 6 months or 1 year. So we expect a great number, a reduction of our employees, a reduction of office space, closure of branches will be massive. We will be requesting POA to consider reducing the mandatory office space of agencies. We are required to have a minimum of 100 square meters, and we might not be able to, unless cost of a high rental goes down in the next 6 months, we cannot afford to continue having 100 square meters of offices. The biggest problem that we are now facing is that the mandatory liability insurance program that has been there since November 8 of 2010, that we are covering all our deployed workers. You know, recruitment agencies are not allowed to deploy a worker unless he enroll or pay insurance cover for the workers mandatory insurance package. What does it cover? It covers automatic repatriation ticket in case of medical problem, no fault resignations, and so on and so forth. It also covers unpaid salaries up to 6 months for 2 years contract. It also provides $7,500 for as an insurance payment in case of natural death, and $15,000 for accident-related death. So the insurance providers are telling us we cannot, under force majeure situation, pay for the liabilities that we covered you. So we are saying if that is the situation and it's required by law that we are going, as we deploy workers from now on, and we have to cover them with mandatory insurance. If this COVID problem will last another 2 years, what's the use of that coverage? So we have been telling our Secretary of Labor and our Administrator of PUA to help us negotiate or bring us to Land Bank and Development Bank of the Philippines to help us with bridge financing. We are clamoring for 1 million to 3 million zero interest bearing loans to probably help us for the next 7 months, and hopefully we can cross. We will be still open by 2021. So that is a very dire situation of the recruitment sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lito, for that input. And you raise problems as well from the point of view of the industry, and you raise also questions. So all of these are actually, a number of these questions are issues that relate to the governance of our migrant workers and the entire industry. Before we proceed to the Q&A portion, to the questions, and I think the panelists, may I invite the panelists to please look at the Q&A portion and see which questions are being directed at you. But before anything else, we have CFAL Philippines has also received a number of questions prior at the start of this webinar. And may I start with two of these questions? Let me read out to you. From the Schneider Electric, I think this is a private group. Could we request to have the list of OFWs that applied online for repatriation, which should be available in the Philippine Embassy website, in order that our OFW knows what is the status of the said application? It is also possible that the list provided have a tentative flight schedule posted. So I think this question is directed at our expert from the DFA. And the other question comes from IOM itself. Which government agencies are able to maintain statistics on, one, OFWs stranded in countries of destination with intent to return? And second, have returned to the Philippines. Is there a shared data hub that is being used and reported to for coordination on OFW return and provision of COVID-19 and reintegration support? So I think those two questions, those two sets of questions I read probably are directed to you, Sec, maybe? Yeah, would you want to answer now, Yusek?
For the list, we have to also realize that there are data privacy issues that have to be taken into consideration, because not all OFWs want their names to be made public, and if they want to return. So, but usually they're really told that they're going home, but as to the dates, as of now, we cannot give definite dates of repatriation except when it's already approved by CAAP. As you know, we still have limits in our airports. We are opening Clark this coming week, for chartered flights. But at the moment, what we know is that when the 24,000 OFWs in Manila have already been transferred to have returned to their home provinces and cities, that's the time that our flights will be more regular. I think people don't realize it, that a lot of airlines are really complaining because they used to fly to Manila every day, and but they couldn't do that anymore. This week, we just had 3 flights from UAE, but it was previously canceled since the first week of May. So it will be really more difficult for us to come up with something like that. But eventually, when things regularize and when we can even say what's what dates that the flights are available, then we can, of course, we can put the flight dates and the repatriation dates, and the list could be given only to those people who are what do you call this, who applied. But I don't think it's something that we would like to err on the side of caution, that it's not for public consumption who comes home and who doesn't. And even especially though and a lot of OFWs don't even want their relatives to know that they're coming home. Secondly, I'm sorry, doctor, what's the other question for the data? Unfortunately, just like before, we do not have a common data because not all posts have polos and OWAs. The only thing that we have embassies and consulates general all over the world, but not in all countries. But what we can assure you is, at least from the Americas, there are 31,000 seafarers waiting to come home, and it's safe to say that the land-based would be in similar numbers, and that's only for the next 2 to 3 months. I don't really know what's the source. We don't have a single data at the moment because we're getting it from our post, what DFA is getting. As to the sources of the other government agencies, I don't really know their exact source. But what the DFA is doing is, any person who comes to the embassy, who goes to the embassy or the consulate, we are helping them to come home. The good thing about, I think, we now have to look at, there are 2 kinds of repatriates. The sea-based. When you say sea-based, the manning agencies have been very, very helpful, and we're very thankful for their help, because they do not only take care of the repatriation, they pay for it, they even take care of the hotels. So the sea-based workers are the most taken care of among our OFWs. But as to the land-based, especially when the contracts have ended, or the employers have filed bankruptcy, and then that's when the Philippine government takes over. That's all. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you, Yusek. There are a number more of questions in the Q&A box, but I'd like to post here. There's a question for Froilan. Under the post-COVID, will the Gulf states be again a major destination post-COVID-19? And I think that's one for Froilan to answer.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you look at historical cases of these economic crises, a lot of these Gulf countries mobilize their sovereign wealth funds, right, in order to restore their domestic economies. You've seen this in 2008, where there's a massive, decline of migrant population, and it skyrocketed right after that. And a lot of these countries, they have, ambitious economic 2030 agendas, and they're still fighting, and they know that they have to be resilient because they have no choice. And, if you look at their, international engagement in terms of building, World Cup 2022 and then the UAE Expo, now it will be 2021. A lot of these Gulf countries, are willing to risk, and defy, these expectations because they've had it before. So what's the difference now? Well, it's more global, but then, you can't really, stop, countries like the Gulf, because it's the kind of market and the kind of policies that they've fought for a long time. And I see them as sort of major destinations in the future, because if you look at Western countries, highly restrictive immigration policies, the next best thing actually is the Gulf, because it's an open market, right? And it's very much open to low skilled, medium skilled, and high skilled. That's why the Gulf countries, they're the largest non-Western migrant destination, and they remit 100 billion. And I do expect them to come back. And I want to respond to Yusek Sara. I mean, in terms of resilience, I mean, I've interviewed nearly 1,000 Filipino workers in the Gulf. And if you look at the number of repatriation that you mentioned, it's 6,000 plus, and the intent are 27,000 or more. if you look at the proportion of that plus the number of displaced Filipinos, 170,000, you could really tell that there is an interest to stay at least 6 months. And remember, a lot of Filipinos, they remit their remittances, back to the Philippines, the money. They don't stay here because they don't get, citizenship or permanent residencies. So when these crises occur, they were caught in this dilemma. They didn't know exactly what to do. So what a lot of them right now are, literally waiting for Gulf countries to either open or close their market. So a lot of them are surviving now because you're seeing a partial lockdown. In the case of UAE, it's partially open, Kuwait and Saudi, because they're able to at least, work part-time. And those who still have jobs, they're able, because in the UAE, for example, 50% of workers are still allowed to work and actually go to the office. Same thing in Kuwait, same thing in the UAE. They're still trying to be resilient because there's still that economic opening for them. And therefore, as you said, they are defiant to that extent. But to go home, I don't think so. Partly because, what's the next best thing in the Philippines? These people have children back home. It's expensive to study in the Philippines or even afford healthcare. Sure, you have universal healthcare system, but there are also caps. And at the same time, a lot of these workers, they have debts, right? I worked with our Philippine ambassador before to the UAE, and literally, these debts are actually, precluding a lot of these OFWs from returning back home. And the cost of migration, returning back to the Gulf countries, it's very expensive. A lot of Filipinos have actually entered these markets illegally, right? Okay, illegally in the case of Philippine law, they entered on a tourist visa. The cost of returning back using a tourist visa, plus the highly bureaucratic procedures, protection measures imposed by our government, are really discouraging them to return because the cost of returning here is actually a little bit more. And with respect to this sort of idea of us being still competitive, I'm still kind of questioning it. I've spent 10 years, in the Gulf countries, and I've seen the evolution of the markets here, partly because, I agree with, Yusuf Farah that there are still competitive markets for Filipinos like nurses, and domestic workers and certain sectors like engineering. But, with the Arab Spring, right, and the close proximity of a lot of African countries, remember, those are much cheaper. They can speak English and Arabs can speak Arabic. So there are, similarities and benefits for employers. And a lot of them are actually maximizing now. And I'm pretty sure Mr. Lorenzo would agree with me that a rising number of African migrants here are slowly phasing out Filipinos in the hospitality, and other sectors too. Now, with respect to, this idea of us not, encourage or discouraging migrants, I mean, it's very, very difficult. I mean, a lot of senior officials are also saying this to me for a long time, but I hate to disagree, partly because, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we've created institutions that could actually facilitate it. We even extract fees from Filipinos, from all these procedures. And we're even in the process of creating an OSW department. I mean, that is sort of like an issue that a lot of Filipinos, even researchers, are basically saying that we are further institutionalizing, maybe in a different context, in a different sort of realm. But the point of not encouraging it, I mean, I would hate to disagree with our undersecretary. And the last part is actually with respect to reintegration. I mean, studies have shown these programs have failed. They're not sustainable. And a lot of Filipinos, they've kept returning back. I can say the World Bank study, some of the DOLE studies, they would actually return back to the Gulf countries. And in fact, some of the prior funds that were extended to Filipinos to start a business, they would literally resell these and actually use them for future migration. What's the alternative back home? I mean, if I want to send my kids, and remember, we have a high fertility rate, and a lot of these families, they have either families here or back home, and they want to send them to university education. The costs are too high. You see this like economic insecurities for a lot of Filipinos. And there is no way that I could afford to send my kids to Ateneo, to La Salle, or even like private universities, or even to go for nursing. It's not livable because in the Gulf, you have at least contractual agreements. These are stable 2 years, assuming that they would stay and renewable. In the Philippines, you have contractualization policies, 6 months. It creates insecurities. So I would hate to disagree with our undersecretary, but based on the research, right, on these data, I think we need, to have more dialogue like this, between the DFA and the researchers outside, because I'm seeing a different, reality here. And I would hate to disagree with her, but I think, to an extent that we are still competitive in certain areas, but to a larger extent, I would really hate to disagree. And knowing Filipinos here, I mean, a lot of them, for example, would, before they would just go to a store and actually buy their own food. But now they actually chip in like $1 or $2. So 10 people in one room could actually collectively, cut their costs. And what the problem right now for a lot of Philippine diplomatic missions here is that if you're asymptomatic and you have COVID, there's no place for them because public and private hospitals or private facilities in the Gulf, they're overloaded with COVID patients already. India, for example, rented 2 villas to accommodate their nationals if you're asymptomatic and COVID. But for Philippines, we don't have a shelter. And I think that is an issue that's why in terms of capacity, I mean, I would question it, and I think a lot of Filipinos, even with the ACA program, 50,000 for sea base and land base and an additional 100. I mean, this actually fueled more intensity, like even, anger from a lot of OFWs, partly because 250,000, right? So I think the last point that I'm making, Professor, is that we do have domestic constraints. And I think this COVID, as she said, right, it's really exposing our limits and also the prospects for a, migration governance renewal. So that's kind of, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Froilan. That's a very passionate response to the question, which brings me to the comments of Dr. Stella Go, which I cannot miss reading out. The experience with the current health crisis highlights the importance of seriously looking into integrating social protection provisions for our migrant workers in our bilateral agreements. And at the end of the day, I mean, all of this experience also tell us that there is no other way but to support and complement probably whatever the government agencies lack in terms of responding to the migrant workers, and for really putting our brains, our minds together and our efforts to say, how could we come up with a more proactive policy in governing our migrants? I mean, the pandemic has really brought and surfaced out a lot of problems, and certainly there are limitations to what the government can do. It is centrally, primarily an actor in the field, but I think there is so much more that should be done and which all of us can contribute to. The industry is also there to shouting out for some assistance because of COVID. And I think this also tells how much more work is needed for the migration governance to be addressed really. Let me also move to the other questions. There are so many questions in the box, and apart from it, I think there are those which are addressed also again to the good USEC. There is one that says, I think on the skills, no, the COVID-19, the pandemic has actually shown us that the skills and knowledge post-COVID-19 may change. So what might be emerging skills and knowledge that are probably, that we see after this pandemic? Anyone who would want to reply or to answer?
Dr. I'll go ahead before Mr. Sariana, if it's okay, sir. I think in a lot of sense that the COVID-19 pandemic isn't something that was projected by any government, and even if you're a first world country, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US or what, I mean, like the health system has, I mean, it has shown how weak the health systems are all over the world, because I remember even in some very developed countries, if you are if you are asymptomatic or you have mild symptoms, even here in the Philippines, you are just going to be placed in your home. You have to self-quarantine. And but the thing is, I think the health sector is something that's very, very, that will definitely, even before this, a lot of ambassadors have already been telling me, because they have aging populations in Europe and even here in Southeast Asia, there will be more caregivers, nurses, and doctors. And especially with this pandemic, and the have learned and have realized that they have to really beef up their health systems. And of course, well, when you're unskilled and you're a household service worker, and it's I mean, to look at it, they're the ones who are now not being displaced. I just hope they're getting paid properly and treated properly, because that's a sector that we couldn't really reach until there's already an abuse. And actually, it will really depend on economies that will open. The service sector will always be there, especially if, for example, Dubai, it's predominantly, it doesn't have oil. So it's really for tourism purposes and everything. So um, it can open. But at the end of the day, I think what's really important is we should revisit the contracts that we have. A while ago in the, what do you call this, in the chat room, they're saying that, do you want to take away from the OFW the right to choose where he or she lives? Actually, that's precisely becoming the problem now in the Middle East. It's because of the cramped quarters, the COVID-19 spreads faster, and that's also happening in Singapore because of the OFWs, the migrants stay in very closed quarters, and they're very cramped there. That's why it's spreading. And if we have to live with COVID-19, and if countries would still want our migrants to enter the part of their societies, then it's going to be part of the contract. A while ago, I was talking with Conjen Jack Cortez, and we were saying that, of course, Filipinos would like to save. But the thing is, because they're all only earning so much, I think it will really add on the cost of migration. But as a country of origin, we really have to fight for this safety net, or this safety, because part of the labor standards, because the what do you call this? You cannot allow our migrants to stay where they're staying now. And we have a lot of SOS from several migrants saying that one of them is positive, then everyone else becomes positive because they're overcrowded, or they're just allowed to live in their quarters. So we are seeing a lot of problems which we have overlooked before. We just have to be able to, especially the recruitment industries here, it's really important that if and when we are going to start deploying workers again, or if our workers start to be deployed with COVID-19, there will be new provisions in the contract. There will be new standards that we have to ask for. And by the way, unfortunately, the sea-based industry, the cruise ships, they that's one of the industries that really is really on a downturn, because they stopped since March. They're paying for all the repatriation. They're not earning now. So that's going to be a very, very big problem, because we know very well that the most well-paid are most of our OFWs are in the cruise industry, and we don't see this. I mean, the industry going back or starting to be operational again, and not anytime before the end of the year.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
If we go back to I agree, the health sector will be still there, will be highly resilient. But if we look at the data over the past 15 years, the average deployment of nurses is in Saudi Arabia, and the average probably is about between 6,000 to 7,000 or 8,000 a year. That's not big enough. What is highly resilient, starting 2007, is the deployment of household service workers. I remember in my data presentation in University of Asia Pacific, in 2012, the average annual deployment of domestic workers to Saudi Arabia was about 8,000 plus. But when we signed the household agreement with Saudi Arabia, it rose to 64,000 that was in 2012. In 2013, it rose to 64,000 and increases up to 100,000 over the next years until 2018. So The growth sector in terms of numbers is the household service sector. Why? And then the question would be, can they continue that number? The why could probably easily answered by the expanding middle class of the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia. Before, the employers of domestic helper when I was there, up to middle of 2000, are mostly the higher end, the rich, the generals, the general managers, the managing directors, the sheikhs. But as the Saudi Arabia, especially after the Arab Spring, when the Saudi government and the other Gulf countries pouring a lot of funds towards involving the middle class into the economy, and the middle class start working either as a worker or if they are into small and medium business, they need more person or household to help them in their house. So we saw a great jump, just that today, probably 50+% of OFWs in GCC are household related workers. Now, there's one data that I forgot to mention, UEA. In the data of Froilan, and also not only in Froilan, but the data of PUA itself. United Arab Emirates has the greatest number of OFWs. Now, we go to data. The population of UAE is about 8 million to 9 million. But the Emiratis are only about 1.8 million. The rest are expat. Can they hire and employ such great number of workers? I don't know the total now. I think there are about 200 or 300,000 OFWs in the Gulf. If you look at reality, I keep on pointing to PUA in 2009, when there was a global financial crisis and Dubai and Abu Dhabi was hit by the global financial crisis. The deployment to UAE in the next 2 years increased by 72%. Why? Because in reality, UAE is the transit points of traffic workers. Most of the workers that are going to UAE that are documented are actually going to Jordan, where then there was a ban of deployment, going to Lebanon when there was a ban of deployment, to Syria, to Kurdistan part of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of GCC. So I think we have to be very careful about the data, and then in terms of probably looking at it on the policy in the PUA. Now, so other sectors, the silver lining, or what is something positive in the GCC? It might be, you might not support me, but the leadership of MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, might be will be very helpful during this crisis. We need strong leaders. We need innovative and highly aggressive leaders during this time. And the presence of and the leadership of MBS in Saudi Arabia could dictate the pace of recovery in the Middle East. Yes, Saudi Arabia has been to deficit spend since even before the Arab Spring. But as soon as MBS started leading the Saudi Arabia, it started really a great change economically and socially. So after the election in US, we believe that there's a strong relationship between US and Saudi Arabia again, and they can help in this world recovery. And if in Europe, Merkel will lead, or Macron of France will also lead. We need leaders, actually. We need strong leaders in this pandemic and global crisis now. And what I'm trying to say is that in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, we have this Prince Sultan. We call him MBS. No? And in Europe, we have the French president, and of course, Germany. And in US, hopefully, our President Trump will change his and becoming more of an economic manager. Then it will hasten economic recovery in the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're running out of time. I think I will just pick out 2 more points and questions, and we can. Obviously, we need the longer conversation, continuing conversation on this about the Filipino migrants. The first point is coming from King Belimac, who said, I think this is for you, Sec. Sarah, if you can find solution for the kabayans that are currently kicked out by the landlords and they don't have place to go. And there are reports that one family is already staying in the tent in the building corridor, and some of them have stayed in the parking lot and park. And we have suggestion for that. If you are willing to hear us, maybe they can connect to the UMWA. Is
Yes.
there a way they could reach out to the UMWA, Yusek,
Yes.
on this? Yeah.
Actually, we have an assistance to Nationals Fund. I can't remember which ambassador I was talking to, but I know for a fact that I think during COVID-19, you're not supposed to kick out anybody. I was talking to Ambassador Joy Quintana yesterday. But even then, if it's happening, please let us know. We have an online or it's OFW Help, and send a message there. We have already given our post standby funds to respond to these kinds of crises, so they should be able to help them. And actually, the problem is a lot of those people who already booked their flights out of their booked their flights to return to the Philippines are stranded because we closed our airports. And that's the bigger problem that we are facing now. And that's for all over the world. But the bigger bulk is in UAE because a lot of people have to. That's why we're trying to get in more planes. And that's why a lot of people also are homeless at the moment because when the airports closed, they already cut ties with their landlords. But please tell them to contact us through OFW Help, Doctor.
Okay. This is, thank you very much, Yusek. This is a follow-up question also on the public health system. Everywhere there is an overwhelming situation for public health system. Someone said, is Mr. Maralit espousing that sending countries set up their own health system in destination countries? Isn't this contrary to the basic principle that all migrants should be treated decently and be given access to public health system of or by the host countries? So that's one. And the other last one is, what's the prospect for the GCC to bounce back? So I think those are questions for Froilan.
Okay, so if you look at Gulf countries' policies with respect to migrants' access to public or private health institutions, if you get sick, for example, if you get COVID or you want to get testing in the public health hospital, it's free if you have all the symptoms and you're positive. So they can arrange that so you don't have to pay for that. But in the private sector, you do have to pay. Now, the biggest challenge here is when a lot of OFWs choose, even if they have symptoms, they choose not to go. Partly because of, if they become positive, they could either lose their job, they could be isolated, they would practically lose their access to, potential work, be it part-time, be it full-time, etc. So the government here, under their humanitarian policies, they offer that, right? But not all actually maximize these, opportunities. So I don't think there's a need for the Philippine government to create, health facilities, right? For a lot of OFWs here, what they need is actually a shelter. But the problem with the shelter is that if you create it like what India is currently doing, this is going to create a lot of costs, and this could really, raise a lot of questions in terms of, what actually is the, official, contingency approach of the Philippine government here. Do they want to repatriate? Do they want to help OFWs elongate their stay here? Specifically those for Filipinos who want to stay for the next 6 months or more. So to answer your questions, Gulf countries' public health institutions, they actually work and they offer this. What we need is actually those additional shelters, but they require a lot of cost and there's a lot of long-term issues for our government. Now, in terms of prospects, for Dr. Edna, you mentioned the prospect for Gulf markets. Is that the question?
Yes, I think that's the spirit of the question. What's the projection for the GCC countries to bounce back?
Okay, so if you currently look at what they're doing right now, right? So COVID cases are going up and they're slowly opening it. So they're taking a lot of risks actually. So if you look at, for example, Kuwait and UAE's phase 1 and phase 2, initially, workers can 30% of workers can allow to work, in the private sector, and they've changed that into 50%. Locals will be required, to start working, fully starting June 1. So if you look at their current, policies, they're trying to revive the market, right, by allowing them to function despite these, the COVID problem. So this will actually, to an extent, help a lot of OFWs to stay here a little bit longer because they're allowed to partially work. Now, what happens if, COVID cases continue to go up, right? And the number of symptomatic or asymptomatic cases also go up. Then that becomes a critical issue. That's when, Gulf countries will start to think about, the cost of, protecting everyone by, allowing them to access their public health institutions. Because at some point they would say, enough is enough, right? We won't be able to do all of this because they are protecting migrant populations by allowing them to access these things. Now, how do you link that to the future economic market, the prospects? Well, it would really depend on, the availability of the vaccine. If you look at, what the UN is saying, it's between 12 to 18 months. So I don't know who's going to survive for the next 12, 18 months with a closed economy or partially open economy. But if you look at what they're doing here, a lot of them are basically trying to, partially open it, inject a lot of localization policies, deportation, and at the same time selectively maintain certain essential workers that they know they would be needed, in the market, like nurses, domestic workers, and certain sectors in the private sector, like engineers, for example. So it's very uncertain, and I think it's conditional. It's conditioned to these factors: availability of the vaccine and whether firms will be able to pick up quickly. Because a lot of them, they filed for bankruptcy. The government the Gulf countries have injected 180 billion economic stimulus packages. But those things, won't necessarily, impact all these firms. So the question now is, what would the market look like in the medium term, from 6 months after 6 months to 1 year? Because a lot of their policies are focused on the next 3 months. And Gulf policies have not really defined, from the fourth, months and onward. So I can't really answer your question, but what I can tell you right now, they're taking a lot of risks, and these risks, given what the UN is saying, what the data are saying, they would likely to, impose a more harder repatriation and more not so good, economic outcome, for the next 6 months. So.
All right. So I think, I'm sorry that we don't have any more time for the other questions and for the other discussion points. That's all the time that we have for the Q&A. And we still have to wrap up this whole session. But before I hand you over to Christine Dady of the IOM, I'd like to say here that UPCPAL Philippines has lined up 4 other webinars for this coming month of June. All the 4 are related to themes around sustainable development goals. So we have June 3, food security in the midst of COVID-19, with the FAO joining UPCPAL Philippines. We also have on June 5, caring in the time of COVID-19, gaps and risks facing Filipino women, and the International Labor Organization is joining us there as co-sponsor and organizer. On June 11, we have Nurture Nature, the impacts of COVID-19 to the planet and people. And we have a number of co-organizers here, which include the SDG Youth Force Philippines, the Junior Chamber International, and Iconic Travels, among others. Also the Youth for Earth Society. And on June 16, we have COVID-19 and young people dealing with the impacts of pandemic on youth's well-being with the UP Department of Family Life and Child Development. But these are interval sessions. I think basically UPCPAL Philippines and IOM will really have to go back, pick up the discussion some more, and pick up more forward-looking resolutions the ease of Filipino migration. I think this is really a very tough topic. So we'll have continuing collaboration, discussion, exchanges of ideas, and hopefully putting things together. So I think that's all the time that we have for now. It is it is my honor to turn over the floor to our good friend, our co-organizer, the chief of mission to the Philippines of the International Organization for Migration, none other than Christine Beatty. Christine, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Great.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Director Edna, for organizing this really rich and interesting discussion. And my best regards to Undersecretary Sarah. Really, it's an honor to have you on the panel together with Jorge and Mr. Loreto Soriano. So great discussion. First, I just want to acknowledge the important topic. COVID is a mobility crisis, but I'm going to come back to the way in which that was titled in a minute. But you know, I came back from this morning. This morning, I was actually I want to talk about the amazing efforts and acknowledge the amazing efforts of the government of the Philippines in return and repatriation. So OFWs who have chosen to return home. I spent the morning down at the bus depot, the PIXT, and saw firsthand really the incredible effort that is going into the return of thousands of stranded OFWs. Really not an easy task, but what an amazing team effort by the Coast Guard, by DFA, by OMWA, by DOT, and of course by the private sector as well. It's really incredible. I think that the Philippines is probably one of the countries leading the way in returning.
Increase the audio, please.
Of their workers. I recall early on, even when this crisis first started, Sarah pointing out how they were sending planes. I mean, they were sending planes to China, to Wuhan at the time, to pick up their OFWs at a really unknown time in the COVID crisis. So my hat's off to the Filipino government for the return and the repatriation of thousands of workers with all these travel restrictions in place. I mean, it's undoubtedly mobility is the defining feature of COVID-19 pandemic. Never before have we seen a disease spread so far and so fast. It shows how interconnected we really are. Never before has there been such a drastic movement of people just stopped. Never before have we seen so many airports closed, so many ports of entries closed, so many people stranded. And unfortunately, never before have we seen such existing inequalities between vulnerable groups, and particularly a lot of the irregular migrant workers. So it is a defining feature, and in that way, it has been a mobility crisis. And I would agree with you, Professor Edna, on the title.
Hi, Ms. Daisy. Can you please increase your audio?
There. Okay. Now can you hear me? Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. I apologize. Sorry, it was a bit choppy. I hope you heard all my congratulations to the government of the Philippines on returning and undertaking a massive operation of the return and the repatriation of the thousands of OFWs. But what I was saying is that, you know, mobility has been a defining feature of the pandemic. We've seen never before so many movements of people just stop and be curtailed, so many airports closed, so many people stranded, and never before have we seen so many inequalities between vulnerable groups and particularly irregular workers. So that in that regard, Professor Edna, it has very much been a it has very much been a mobility crisis. But I think also we have to acknowledge that the role that migration and mobility can play in the recovery. I think I was asked to give a few statistics or a few comments on the remittances, and undoubtedly, you know, global remittances, which drive so much of the economy globally, are projected to decline by 20%. And that is just a really incredible and devastating number, and will lead to an economic crisis that our Secretary General has said we have not seen since the likes of the Great Depression. So the remittances and the ties to migration are definitely going to be devastating. Here in the Pacific and East Asia, the remittances are projected, according to the World Bank, to decline by 13%. The Philippine government, NEDA, has been anticipating a 20 to 30% decline in international remittances for 2020. So it will have a devastating impact on the recovery. But migration can also play a role in the recovery. I think it's really interesting in the National Migration Survey, which maybe many of you, I don't know if many of you have had the opportunity to look at, but there's an interesting statistic in there about the remittances from internal migration. And the remittances from internal migration are just as great as the remittances from, according to the National Migration Survey, from external migration. So I think that's important, and that shows as well how important internal migration is to the economy here in the Philippines. So we can't forget that, because I know a lot of the dialogue is so much focused on international migration, but there's a big role to play in internal migration as well, in the role of remittances in the recovery. Yusek Sarah made an important point on the importance of reintegration. And if I may, Professor Edna, or Director Edna, it would be really good to do a future, and maybe you already have organized that, but a future seminar on reintegration.
Sure, we'll do it together.
Let's do it together, because this is, I think, really critical. I mean, we know that the government's been very generous in providing pesos, one-time peso payments to vulnerable migrants, but I think we really need to look at the framework around reintegration post-COVID, and how we can look at not just the individual reintegration, but the community reintegration aspects in a post-COVID environment. And we have a lot of good practices and best practices, and looking at reintegration really from a more holistic approach. So I think that would be an excellent topic for the future.
Agree.
Great. And then finally, I mean, I just want to say that I agree as well with Yusek, Sarah, that migration is a choice. And I think it's commendable that the government has brought back those migrants who have chosen to return. And we have to, ensure we also, IOM is not in the business of promoting migration, but we are in the business of ensuring migration is safe and orderly and regular. So I think ultimately there will be a drive for migration again, particularly to the Midwest. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I just suspect, and based on what I've been reading, particularly for certain economies, the caregivers, you're going to eventually bounce back with the dramatic, need for migrant workers. And so we have to ensure that migration takes place in a safe way, that people are not, because of the economic situation they're facing at home, are not feeling so, desperate that you have, unscrupulous recruiters come in and take advantage of this desperation. So I think that'll be really important in the future. There will be, migration has always driven economies, and more so in the last 10 to 20 years. We've been more interconnected than ever before. And so as countries start to open up and the demand will, start up again for migrant workers, because their economies, as you've already pointed out, with all your data. Their economies are very much dependent on migrant workers. We have to ensure that more than ever that migration is safe, that recruitment is done in a way that is most protective of migrant workers, that migrant workers aren't paying extraordinary fees to migrate. They shouldn't have to pay fees to be recruited. Nobody should have to pay a fee for their job. We continue to say that. As we look at this as a mobility crisis, I think we also have to look at the opportunities that migration will bring in the post-COVID recovery. And I also just want to recognize one of the the amazing heroic efforts of so many migrant workers as first line responders. I mean, my country, I'm from America, and so many Filipino nurses who have passed away because of COVID and have been on the front line taking care of COVID patients. Let's not forget that migrant workers have really been the heroes in the COVID response as well. So when people talk about, the anti-discrimination and blame migrants for bringing COVID to their country, we also have to remind those that migrant workers have been on the front line of the response, and many of them have given up their lives, unfortunately. So let's look at this as not just a crisis, but an opportunity would be my final concluding words. So thanks to everybody on the panel. Thanks to Dr. Edna for organizing another rich discussion and seminar, and I look forward to future ones, and particularly one on reintegration.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. OMG, that's really fantastic closing remark from you. And that's an excellent added value of having someone from the IOM to come in and say the mobility crisis is not just about the Gulf states, Philippines, and back, but it's also about not just the international mobility, but also the internal migration issues, which then bring us to the point that at the end of the day, the bottom line really of migration and all programs related to migration as a human right is bringing well-being and the benefits of migration to each and every person, to the community. And that brings us further into the looking at it in terms of recovery from this COVID-19 crisis, recovery from the wicked pandemic, recovery, and therefore, which is also going to segue to reintegration. And I really think that there's so much more that all of these people who signed up as participants are excellent players, very vigorous players on the migration. And there is no other way but for us to continue the discussion, the conversation, and to pitch in every way we can. So on behalf of the University of the Philippines, Philippines, I'd like to really, really thank from the bottom of our hearts, Fräulein Malit, who's really been very always at the side of UP Philippines, UPCPAL on the migration issue. So with the honorable, hardworking Yusek Saralu Ariola, our dear friend from the industry, Lito Soriano, and of course, our constant companion in our conversations on migration, Christine Dady. Thank you to everyone, and this would not have been possible without the hard work of all the staff in UPCPAL Philippines. So thank you very much. Thank you so much, the whole world, for listening to this conversation. And we look forward to the next one. So please hang on. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Edna. Thank you. Thank you, Yusek.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.